In the last days of Jesus' life, we are speaking today with Professor Alessandro Barbero, Emanuele Rocchetti, Francesca Fanelli, and Pilat Sorace. Professor, before we begin the question of questions, the things we are discussing today are the things that are present at this moment.
In today's episode, we discuss whether the stories about Emperor Augustus from 2,000 years ago are real or not. I would say this: we know much less about antiquity than we would like to know. We know many things, but not everything about the powerful of the time, about Augustus, about Tiberius, about their relatives, about their ministers, and about the poor people living in the empire. We know very little. So if we have 4 out of 5 testimonies about the life and death of a subject, a miserable person living in a distant province of the empire, written within a few decades of when the events occurred, it seems a bit difficult to think that this person did not really exist. There is no other subject of the Roman Empire about whom we have so much information. Then, of course, since this man created a movement that imagined him, that wanted to see him as the long-awaited Messiah by the Jews, and later as the Son of God, the initiator of a new life for all humanity, it is clear that those who believed in him also imagined many things. Therefore, we cannot be sure of the individual details of Jesus' life and death until other details come to light. For example, that Pontius Pilate existed because there are inscriptions that mention him, but that Jesus existed and did more or less what is recounted to us, I believe, is largely indisputable.
Because, as you said, historians talk about it only a few decades later, and there are no contemporary historians who discuss it.
In fact, to tell the truth, those who speak about it are not historians, and this is a first difficulty because the authors of the Gospels, they are not doing the work of a historian who compares sources and testimonies, who raises doubts. They are recounting what the disciples remember about the Master. And for a few years they told it indeed. For a few years we must imagine that the memories of what Jesus said and what he did passed from mouth to mouth. And it is clear that at that point the memories, so to speak, become larger and richer. Then at a certain point they decided to write them down, and that is the Gospels.
The first chapter of our story, the one we are discussing with Professor Barbero, aside from the Gospels, there are few attestations of the historicity of Jesus.
The life of Jesus of Nazareth, up to the final days culminating in his death and resurrection, is narrated by the Gospels, the canonical ones written by Matthew, Luke, Mark and John between 65 and 90 AD, and the so-called apocryphal ones, written later and of more uncertain origin. But what are the attestations of the historicity of Jesus? What testimonies emerge in non-Christian contexts regarding his story? The most significant is that of Pliny Cornelius Tacitus. In the 15th book of the Annals, commenting on the fire of Rome in 64 AD, for which it is rumored that Emperor Nero himself is responsible, he writes as follows:
To stifle every rumor, Nero framed and condemned to particularly cruel punishments those whom the common people, detesting them for their infamies, called Christians. They derived their name from Christ, condemned to punishment under Emperor Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate.
Around 120 AD. It is the biographer of the Roman emperors, Gaius Vetonio, who provides another significant clue about the figure of Jesus, called the Christ. In the chapter dedicated to Emperor Claudius, it is written that he expelled the Jews from Rome, who were a continuous cause of disorder due to the instigation of Christ. Pontius, the young governor of Bithynia, also refers to Christ and the Christians in a letter where he asks Emperor Trajan whether the procedures he is applying to Christians are correct or not. Interesting, yet controversial. It is also the testimony that appears in Book 68 of the Jewish Antiquities by the historian Flavius Josephus, written around 93 to 94 AD, known as the Testimonium Flavium.
During this time, Jesus lived, a wise man, although one must define him as a man. He, indeed, performed extraordinary actions and was a teacher of men who welcomed the truth with delight. He was the Christ, even when, At the accusation of those who among us are the leaders, Pontius Pilate had him crucified. Those who had loved him from the beginning did not cease to love him. He appeared to them on the third day alive again, as the prophets had predicted about him.
Nothing else significant emerges regarding the historical figure of Jesus. No other text refers to his activities, which are likened to those of the many prophets, preachers, and charismatic healers who roamed the region during that time. That tumultuous Palestine, awaiting a Messiah to free them from Roman domination.
And so, why do you not want to read the signs of the times?
Pilate Saurus, from what I have heard, the most complete account seems to be that of Flavius Josephus.
Yes, the most complete, but also the most controversial account has long been debated regarding its total truthfulness, because Flavius Josephus is a Jewish historian who did not convert to Christianity and therefore has always been doubted on his claims about Jesus being the Christ, which are quite biased. In fact, then in 1971, a Syriac manuscript was discovered that would testify to much more modest claims. Why is this? Because we have to think that our sources have come through centuries of interpolations by scribes, obviously in a Christian context, etc., who would add a bit of the passages that they thought should be included in these texts.
This is exactly what you were saying, Professor, an integration of information. It is not simply the account of Flavius Josephus, but something that tells us that this account is fundamentally true.
Let's say it is something that goes beyond that, because one thing is the fact that an evangelist writes 30, 40 years after the death of Jesus and has heard wonderful stories. One of the evangelists heard that he raised a certain Lazarus from the tomb and writes it down. The other three have never heard it, so they do not write it. Everyone writes what has come to them. Here we are faced with something even more refined, namely a Jew, but Romanized, integrated into the empire, who cannot help but recount, if the opportunity arises, that there was this character and this phenomenon. However, we also have the text of Flavius Josephus, which was not written by him. And the mechanism that we must imagine is this: Flavius Josephus writes, Jesus lived in that era, and he writes that he is copying, but this is Christ. And he adds, he was the Christ. And it seems to us that these are the words of Flavius Josephus, while in reality they are very likely not.
However, summarizing the context of the era, Jesus Christ was the leader of a Jewish revolt that had its own characteristics. And there was indeed another Jewish revolt that wanted to be armed, fighting. Is this the picture of the era?
Perhaps even the word revolt is controversial. He is certainly a preacher, and he is certainly someone who wants to introduce a reform of the Jewish religion.
Who opposes the established powers of the Jewish world of the time?
Certainly. Then obviously, if one is a Christian, they believe that he is actually the Son of God who came not to correct, but to completely transform what was the ancient religion into the new Christian faith. But in any case, it is a non-violent movement, and this distinguishes it from many other movements that existed in the Jewish world.
Emanuele Roccetti, why do some Gospels not end up in the New Testament?
Yes, these are writings from the time, and many of them did not make it into the canon of the Gospels of the New Testament, precisely because they often presented too Jewish an image of Jesus, or a rather agnostic spiritual view, which then diverged from what would become Christian orthodoxy. One of these is the Gospel of Thomas, a rather particular gospel that gives a spiritual, mystical image of Jesus, almost as if he were a monk living his earthly existence in its total completeness. This is why Thomas does not speak, does not recount either the death of Jesus or the resurrection. He does not narrate the events, but exclusively reports the words of Jesus. In the context of a Christian selection for the Gospels of the New Testament, we must also emphasize that many were discarded because they did not meet the suitable criteria for the dissemination of the message. Regarding what you mentioned at the beginning, you spoke of 4 testimonies, the Gospels, which are all in all consistent. However, there are others that, because they are not consistent, have been discarded.
So let's return to the historian, but how do we choose that those 4 essentially tell us a true story?
But in fact, it is not us who declare that those four are better as historical sources compared to the others. The choice of the four canonical Gospels is a theological choice. At a certain point, the Church decided to recognize these texts as effectively transmitting the true teaching of Christ. It should be understood without even expecting them to correspond in every detail, because theologians have always known that there are contradictions even among the four canonical Gospels. But it doesn't matter, precisely because the Christ that interests the Church is not just the man who historically lived. It is a message that has another significance, even metaphysical. What do we historians learn? That these sources also contain contradictory accounts, so not everything inside is historically true. And so, even in the Gospels that the Church does not recognize as canonical, there may perhaps be aspects of the Christ who truly existed. Certainly, and for us it is equally interesting, something that people believed about Christ, because what millions of believers have believed and recounted for centuries is actually even more interesting. We will never know if Jesus really did or did not do certain things, said or did not say certain things. We will never know if he really made the terracotta birds. His followers believed that he could give them life. One apocryphal gospel recounts. But let us reconstruct a world, the world of that East, dominated and framed by the Roman Empire, where there was, however, a whole metaphysical ferment, a civilization that was very different from the Greco-Roman one, and yet it has shaped our world.
I was intrigued by something in the video, that letter to Trajan from Pontius Pilate the Younger. But did Trajan respond to Pontius Pilate the Younger?
Certainly, he replied, and we are in the context of the 2nd century after Christ. From Trajan's response, a rather moderate attitude appears. As Trajan states that Christians should not be pursued directly, and there should be no hunting for them, of course, if reported, they can be punished, but first of all, anonymous denunciations were not considered. Furthermore, the accused could always claim not to be a Christian by sacrificing to the gods. This testimony is very important from a historical point of view because to date we do not have certainty whether Christianity was actually considered a crime. There is no legal basis from this perspective.
Yes, of course, there is no legal basis to consider it a crime, but at the same time it is certain that the police and Christians fundamentally must categorize it. So they are considered offenders, if nothing else. There is an evident antipathy. After that, there are more moderate emperors who say that these people are a danger, but they do not want to launch a witch hunt. Keep an eye on them for now, and then we will see.
Now I will show you a video. According to the Gospel of John, an event prompts the Sanhedrin to want the death of Jesus, and it is precisely what you mentioned earlier, the resurrection of Lazarus.
Mother, thank you for listening to me, Father. Now those who are truly indeed around me will see that I am the resurrection and the life. And whoever certainly has faith in me will live forever.
Lazarus, please come forth!
Professor, you said earlier that the resurrection of Lazarus exists only in one gospel, and we have argued, in fact, it is argued that this is what triggers the anger of the Sanhedrin. But then, according to the other gospels, what is it that triggers the anger of the Sanhedrin?
The anger of the Sanhedrin, meanwhile, we must not forget that the Gospels are written from a religious perspective in which Jesus came to earth to sacrifice himself, to die, to save humanity. Therefore, the Sanhedrin must be angry with him, essentially. Everything that Jesus does is naturally done to alarm the guardians of tradition.
We now enter the second chapter, Welcomed. As the Messiah, Jesus enters Jerusalem, and these are his last days.
In the week leading up to the Jewish Passover, Jesus, riding on a donkey, enters Jerusalem, surrounded by crowds who acclaim him as the Messiah.
Look, see the door who holds a vile masso against you?
At this point, according to the Gospels, his fame is already widespread throughout the region, especially due to the miracles that have revealed his divine nature. In Jerusalem, crowded with pilgrims, Pontius Pilate is also present at that moment. From the entrance to Jerusalem, it is impossible to establish a chronology of what happens from Palm Sunday to Thursday, traditionally recognized as the day of the Last Supper. According to the Gospels, Jesus, in the early days of Passion Week, dedicates himself essentially to preaching and teaching in the temple, and in the evening, he withdraws with his disciples outside the city walls, near the Mount of Olives. It is primarily aimed at contesting the management of worship and the Jewish religious authority. The scribes and Sadducees, the most stringent guardians of tradition, demand the inflexible and complete respect of the law.
Do you want our people to no longer respect the Sabbath rest?
But if one of you had a goat that fell into a well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you go immediately to rescue it? God made the Sabbath for man, not man for the Sabbath.
No, we realize this. We understand what you mean. But won't it create confusion for the uninformed?
The scribes question Jesus, asking him where he derives his authority, his power. They try to put him in difficulty, to trap him, until Jesus performs a remarkable gesture.
Jerusalem, the most infamous of cities, you cannot love two masters. Your God is money. But what bridge do you have? My money! No. This is the house of prayer. You have turned it into a den of thieves!
From this moment on, according to the Gospels, the leaders of the Sanhedrin conspire to have him killed. But who do they really fear? The man who came to bring peace or the sword? The preacher or the revolutionary who speaks of destroying the temple? Thursday, 14th Nisan. It is the evening of the Last Supper, marked by the institution of the Eucharist.
This is the bread of life. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. Take and eat.
In the same circumstance, Judas Iscariot reveals himself as a traitor, ready to hand over the master to his enemies for 30 pieces of silver. But it must be done without drawing attention. The leaders of the Sanhedrin fear the reaction of the crowd, which follows and venerates the Nazarene. The most suitable place to capture Jesus is the Garden of Gethsemane, on the Mount of Olives.
This is the hour, Judas. The hour of darkness. Oh, Master. With this kiss, you betray me.
You see that it is a revolt, that it is a revolution, Pilate saw us. This revolt brought into the temple is that of a great leader of the people. Now I do not enter into a religious matter, but it indeed raises concerns for the Sanhedrin.
Yes, the concern is not so much about the gesture itself, because, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jeremiah is mentioned, thus the Old Testament, which means that the prophet actually had defined this den of thieves as not his temple, thus fighting to defend it from the thieves. and from the fraudulent merchants that Jesus found and got rid of. In the Sanhedrin, the concern is that authority is assumed over this man who does not respect the process because there were very few ordinations and therefore all the ranks needed to be respected. This man arrives and claims to have power when he cannot have it. That is how he is an outlaw.
Yes, that is true. And one must also consider the context of the Jewish people at that time who were under Roman military occupation, and the authorities are collaborationist authorities who have guaranteed to maintain order. The people will remain calm, will pay taxes, but the people risk not remaining calm. Because another thing we forget is that Jesus is not only hated and seen as a danger by the Sanhedrin, even though it is rarely discussed. It is certain that a part of the Jewish people, faced with someone coming and saying that the temple needed to be cleansed and the rules overturned, would have attacked him, just as a few years later they would attack St. Paul. St. Paul preaches in Jerusalem, and it is the Jews themselves, the crowd, who attack him, forcing the Roman soldiers to arrest him to keep him safe in a cell. Then I must say that Jesus' aggression against the temple is really... This is something to interpret in a very layered way, because in our civilization it has naturally become the symbol of the fact that the sacred and the profane should not be mixed. However, Jesus in the temple strikes at very traditional religious practices. Because the merchants were there selling animals for sacrifice, good people would go to the temple to buy a goat, or if they were poor, a pigeon or dove to sacrifice to God. And the money changers were there because people wanted to make offerings at the temple. But in the temple, images are not allowed, not even Roman coins with the face of Caesar.
It's very clear. Listen, Francesca Fanelli, try to help us make sense of this, Francesca. Sadducees, Pharisees, what do all these names correspond to?
They correspond to the division of Jewish society, which was quite differentiated internally. From ancient authors, we know that there were the Sadducees, who were the aristocrats, from whom the high priest derived, representing the Jewish people before the Roman Empire, and, for example, the Pharisees, who were more popular and were those who strictly observed the law, among whom were the Zealots, who were more politically active because they claimed independence.
The other sect opposed to that of Jesus, but we are faced with a politically complex reality. And perhaps the outcome of this story is due to that complexity. It was not easy to find a solution to those days lived in the year that is then unknown.
No, and these are the cases in which politics decides that it is better to simplify, and to simplify drastically. Of course, Jesus' position is anything but simple, because until we understand what these words mean, we think precisely of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Jesus is against the Jewish elites, which are actually secularized and Hellenized elites, meaning they live like the Greeks now, go to the gym, play sports, and Jesus is against this. However, it is also against the zealots, against the fanatics of the literal interpretation of the law, so in reality, it has a very difficult path to follow.
One last question. Something that has always left me pondering is the role of Judas. Is it possible that the Romans needed Judas for a ridiculous payment of 30 denarii, which has been counted as equivalent to 30 euros or something like that, and that he gave a kiss to Jesus to indicate and find him? It was evident who the leader was. This story of Judas doesn't make sense to me.
Well, the Romans didn't need it, but perhaps the Christians did. Let me explain. Judas is the archetypal traitor. He has become a synonym in our common language.
Only that his figure is completely overturned, read in a new light, in these writings, in the Gospel of Judas, indeed, discovered in Egypt.
In the 1970s or so of the last century, the Gospel emphasizes the fact that it was necessary for Judas to betray Jesus, thus positioning himself as an instrument for the fulfillment of the divine plan of redemption for humanity, where the sacrifice of Jesus was central. Here, Judas is read as the apostle, closest to Jesus, an apostle aware of his tragic fate, which was to betray a friend in order to sell him to the Roman authorities. Why is it necessary for Christians? Because Christians, and Christianity in general, gradually distancing themselves from their Jewish roots, need to negatively portray the figure of the Jew, and thus Judas becomes the negative symbol.
It convinced me, likewise. It is a political operation to identify Judas as the traitor In fact, Pope Benedict XVI has also made some very interesting analyses on the role of Judas. It is invented that he is a traitor because either way, if it is necessary for Judas to kiss Jesus for the process to be fulfilled, he is not a traitor. This is a fundamental piece of the story of the last days of Jesus.
Certainly. And here we can be at ease. It is clear that there was no need for Judas to go there to kiss Jesus, so that the temple soldiers would know whom they were to arrest. I am not a theologian, and I have never asked myself this question. It comes to mind now that there is certainly an answer. Perhaps it has already been given by Pope Benedict. The name Judas itself is a heavy name. One of the two great kingdoms of the Jews in the past was the Kingdom of Judah. It is a name that is almost synonymous with Jewish nationality. Many Jews have likely pondered this question. But let us enter the third and final chapter of our story. Jesus is tried and condemned to death for high treason. On the night of Thursday, Jesus is brought before the high priest Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, to be interrogated.
A second interrogation takes place in the early hours of Friday, right in front of the high priest Caiaphas.
I ask you now, in the name of the Eternal, are you truly the Messiah? The one who is foretold in the Scriptures, the Son of God, the Savior of humanity, as it is written in the holy texts, the prophesied one who has come to save us all. I am...
For the Sanhedrin, Jesus is guilty of blasphemy, an accusation that carries the death penalty. But the Sanhedrin is not allowed to carry it out. Only the Roman authority can do so. The Nazarene is then brought before the procurator of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Pilate is not inclined to comply with the requests of the Sanhedrin. But there is an accusation that the prefect of Rome cannot ignore, the self-proclamation of Jesus of Nazareth as King of the Jews.
Are you really the King of Judah?
If my kingdom were of this world, my people would not have hesitated to fight to try to free me.
Oh, you speak of a kingdom. Then you must surely be a king. Are you a king?
Yes, there. For I have come into the world to testify to the truth.
And what is then this truth?
This man is indeed a dreamer, not a criminal.
Pilate seeks a way out, while the Sanhedrin presses for a death sentence. At the end of his inquiry, Pilate finds no fault in Jesus. Even the accusation of having proclaimed himself King of the Jews does not seem valid to him. But the members of the Sanhedrin insist. If you do not condemn him, they say, you are not a friend of Caesar. The crime of lèse-majesté for non-Roman citizens, such as Jesus, carries the death penalty by crucifixion. Pontius Pilate has only one last attempt left, as prescribed by tradition for the Easter festivities, to release a prisoner, Jesus or Barabbas, the preacher or the thief responsible for murder and sedition. The crowd chooses Barabbas. Nothing. You don't know him. Jesus, crucified with his feet and wrists pierced by nails, breathes his last after about 3 hours of agony, around 3 in the afternoon on Friday. According to the Gospels, a member of the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea, takes care of his burial. According to the evangelist John, Nicodemus, another member of the Sanhedrin, is also with him. On Sunday morning, some women arrive at the tomb and find it empty. For the Romans and the opponents of Christians, it would have been his friends who stole the body of the Nazarene and spread the rumor of the resurrection. According to the Gospels, however, Jesus would have truly risen, and after his death would have met with his disciples several times.
It was all written. The Son of Man had suffered.
and the third down would rise from death in his glory.
Piazzo Sorazzi, another story that doesn't convince me is that of Pontius Pilate. He ultimately delegates such an important decision to those who raised the issue, the Jews, and a narrative has emerged that he washed his hands of it. No, he did something legitimate. Sorazzi.
Yes, indeed, the inaction of Pontius Pilate has been greatly re-evaluated by a legal historian who has raised the case, arguing, through Roman law, one of these norms was that the vain voices of the people should not be heard or listened to. So it truly seems implausible that Pontius Pilate went to the people and thus washed his hands, as the story tells us.
Pontius Pilate is primarily a character from a novel, from great novels like The Master and Margarita, for example, by Bulgakov. However, as a historian, I would say that in any case, Pontius Pilate is an example of how the Roman Empire functioned, that is, trying to get along with the local elites and also with the populations, because you cannot always just repress. And in that sense, perhaps all things considered in front of the tumultuous crowd, he is also a Roman governor. It may be that now and then he preferred to take a step back.
Emanuele Lucchetti, what is written on the plaque on the cross? What does it mean?
Also by the work of Pontius Pilate, the choice to write INRAI, that is, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, allows us to... The Roman Empire involuntarily carried out an action by reporting the reason for the condemnation of this death row inmate, and instead of writing, "He who claimed to be the King of the Jews," Pontius Pilate summarizes it and writes directly, "the King of the Jews."
So it is he who confers the title upon him. The one who is presented as your king, you have killed him as you wished.
Certainly at one point Jesus says to him, "You have said so," right? And so it certainly comes from there. After that, I have many doubts and realize that I am not sufficiently prepared for this episode because, for example, in those parts they spoke much more Greek than Latin. Did they really put this inscription on the cross in Latin?
I doubt. Francesca Fanelli, what is the history of the cross afterwards?
Well, it is interesting to note how the symbol of the cross has undergone a complete metamorphosis. Initially, crucifixion was the ultimate humiliation, as we have also seen from the footage. It is perhaps the worst of the tortures attributed not to Roman citizens, but only to slaves and those who were not citizens. It indeed becomes the symbol of the Christian message, the symbol of humanity's salvation par excellence. Obviously, this change will happen gradually, but we can identify a turning point with Constantine, not only for the famous vision in this sign you will conquer, but also because he abolished crucifixion.
And certainly because at that point it is clear that it is no longer possible to continue crucifying people in a Christian empire where indeed a God is worshipped, who came to be crucified. After that moment, from Constantine onwards, crosses also entered churches, just as statues would later, all things that Christians initially kept at a distance, so to speak. In other words, the Christians of the early centuries were very different from those who came after, and we still know too little about them.
Professor, as a historian, what is the significance of the turning point of Jesus' death and resurrection? What does it mean?
The birth of the Christian movement and the fact that the Christian movement, although indeed spied on by the police and watched by governors like in the time of Trajan and Pontius Pilate, continued to live, prosper, and grow within the Roman Empire, and then at a certain point established itself and swept away the entire old religious world. Here, in this sense, it is true that the experience of Jesus and Christianity is one of the great turning points in human history, because until that moment for millennia, anyone who thought about religion, heaven, and celestial powers was polytheistic. Many gods, many deities, each with their own, and in today's world, such positions are greatly diminished. In today's world, great religions that believe in a single God dominate. Always the same, among others, for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. This is a truly radical change, and it comes from the Middle East. The Middle East, which millennia ago gave agriculture, livestock, and cities, at that moment gives humanity something else, not necessarily better, but different, and which has changed the world again, the great monotheistic religions. And there is indeed a force there. In these peoples, who are portrayed in our documentaries as ragged, wearing patched-up clothes and barefoot in the sand, there is a strength within them that has changed the course of world history more than once.
Everything comes from there. and it is a world that we must therefore know better and respect in its complexity. You need to give us that one additional book now.
Yes, I recommend one because I have a summary book on all these topics. There is a wealth of specialized studies, but here one needs to get a general idea of what Christianity was like in the time of Jesus. I would suggest a book by a historian named Paul Mattei, who is French, so it should be referred to as Mattei's Ancient Christianity from Jesus to Constantine. I thank Professor Alessandro Barabbas and also thank you for the insights from Emanuele Lucchetti, Francesca Fanelli, Pontius Pilate Soraci, and I will move on to the conclusions.
A Pope, Benedict XVI, said it, and Alessandro Barabbas has reiterated it now. The figure of Judas can no longer be considered merely that of a vulgar traitor. Giacomo Todeschini studied the issue of the 30 pieces of silver, establishing that it was a very small amount and that it was not possible for such an important historical decision as handing Jesus over to the Romans to be determined by such a low figure. In fictions, Borges elaborates on the figure of Judas, who actually understood well what Jesus' mission was, and in agreement with Jesus would have supported it. Thomas de Quince also wrote that Judas intervened in the debate at that time about whether the Jews should rebel against the Roman occupation through armed struggle or a peaceful revolution, and it was within this debate that Judas played his role